Thank you very much. And if I can just get out of this, I think. Let's see. I'm just going to minimize that, and then I can probably find mine. There we go. Okay, thanks. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to come speak to you about feral horses in the West. Somebody asked me, why are they feral and not wild? Well, under the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971, they're called wild. But as a scientist, any species that's domesticated and then released into the wild is called feral. And I work internationally as well. And so when I'm talking to colleagues in Mongolia that actually have native Przewalski's horses, they're confused if I call them wild. So we always say feral. Okay, so before I start, I just want to acknowledge my co-PIs on all the research that I'm doing, our crew leader who's helped collect all of the data. We have many field technicians and lots of volunteers who've helped do the work. And we are funded and very grateful to the Wild Horse and Burro Program, BLM, and to USGS that has supported this work. So what I'm going to talk about today is, first I'll give you an overview of sort of the evolution and history of horses, how they got here, this sort of shifting view, our shifting view of animals in America and our differing relationships with them. We're going to talk about Wild Horse Annie, and then we're going to talk about the controversy. This is a very controversial subject in the West. So we're going to talk about the impact of horses on Western ecosystems, and then I'm going to go through some of the projects that we're working on to try to bring some science to the table. So the Equidae evolved in North America. There were at least 27 species of Equus during the Pleistocene. Horses radiated through Beringia, the temporary land connection between North America and Asia, and there were multiple extinctions and repopulations in North America. Yeah, for 2 to 3 million years. Then horses went extinct in the Great Pleistocene megafaunal extinction. So all these other species went extinct at the same time. Camels, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, the dire wolf, the cabeloid horses, which is what I'm talking about tonight. Bison antiquus, those were the giant bison that were found in Great Sand Dunes. Giant sloths, Irish elk. It is believed that they went extinct because of rapid and variable climate change, which caused a contraction of grasslands in North America. That's one theory. Also, competition with ruminants may have had a role in that as well. The ruminant species are very efficient in their digestion. They can eat food. They have to eat higher quality food, but when they do eat it, they can really take a lot of nutrients out of it. And also for carnivores, perhaps it was just the loss of that prey. It's thought that maybe native human overhunting had a role, but really what it did is gave rise to the to the emergence of all the modern species. So equids continued to evolve, though, in Asia, where they still survived, and eventually domestication of horses occurred, but that was like 6,000 years ago. So horses have been domesticated for a very, very long time. It was primarily for milk and meat. The very first, and this was actually in what's today Kazakhstan, but what they've discovered in the Botai culture is corrals where they probably milked the mares, first of all. And also, it's important to note that the distribution of horses today really is about human distribution, that horses went with humans everywhere. So today there are 7 extant native species of horses of the equids family remaining. There's Przewalski's horses. These are the true wild horse in Mongolia and actually Asia. Grevy's zebra, plains zebra, and mountain zebra. The Asiatic wild ass and the African wild ass and the Kayang. Almost all of these are threatened or endangered species. Then we have the feral burro or donkeys, which is basically, we have these here, they're the domesticated variety of African wild asses. And in the United States, we have some Nubian subspecies and some other subspecies of African wild asses. And no one's done a lot of genetic work on them yet, but I think that that's coming. And then we have the domestic or feral horse, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So horses came here on the second expedition of Christopher Columbus. That's how they got here. We know this because of the Queen's manifest. The cargo log on the Spanish ships told us what was on those ships. After being brought to North America, horses became a very integral part of our culture. When the Indians got the horses, they used them in warfare, they used them to hunt. They really became a part of their culture. And horses basically pulled our wagons out west, and they helped us plow our fields. And we rode them into war. So they're really closely tied to, I would even say coevolution. Our cultural evolution is very tied to horses. So they're really beloved. But what happened is with the evolution of transportation, the invention of automobiles, they basically made horses less necessary. Motorized tractors, tanks, and other machinery replaced the role of horses in warfare and tillage. And horses really were no longer required, and they became more companion animals. There's a terrific paper, Why Are Humans So Emotional About Feral Horses, by one of my colleagues that is worth reading. It kind of chronicles all of this. Also at this time in our history in the United States, we had changing views and a changing sense of how we valued animals. The Humane Society was founded in 1954, and really the start of the modern animal rights movement was around the early 1970s. So these horses that were no longer used in many areas, they were either released in the West or they just simply escaped, and they formed feral populations. Then come the Mustangers. In the 1950s, the Mustangers would go out and they would catch horses, and they would sell them for dog food or for for slaughter, for whatever. They used the horses, and they basically went out and captured them. But it was images like this that disturbed people with everything else going on. This was very disturbing to see animals being treated like this. And so along came Wild Horse Annie. So Velma Johnson started a letter writing campaign with elementary school kids in Congress. So all these elementary schools all across the country, they sent letters, and she had pictures like that and such so people could see what was going on. And Congress passed the Wild Horse and Burro Act in 1971 to protect horses from harassment and from being captured like that. So we're going to fast forward now to today. So that was back in 1971. We did a great job protecting horses. We did a really good job protecting horses. And so today their populations are very high. And I want to show you this. I'm gonna just move over here so I can point. So if you look at the green bar, that's the on-range population. So these are all the horses that are out in the West on all the herd management areas. So BLM manages the herds in the West for the most part. Forest Service does some too, but most of them are on BLM lands. Anyway, so these horses are all out in the wild, and you can see the population going down and then the population coming back up. I don't have an updated slide, I apologize, but in 2014 there were 48,000 horses in the wild. So this is the black line, the black bar, I'm sorry, is the off-range population. Those would be animals that have been rounded up and brought in and made available for the public to adopt. So all the horses that are rounded up and taken off the range, they're taken off the range because there's a certain number that are, it's called an appropriate management level, but you can't have too many of any ungulate. They have to be managed. And so as the population on the range keeps going up, they want to be able to remove more and put them in a holding or let the public adopt them or do something with them so that they're not causing habitat degradation on the range, on the western rangelands. So that's what's going on now. So in 2014, there were 48,000 animals. In 2019, there was 89,000. So I want you to just think for a minute about how quickly that population nearly doubled. Horses are very incredible. They survive. They have very high survival. They're very fecund. They are very successful having babies every single year, and they have high foal survival as well. So they do really well, and they do really well in areas where there are no people, like in the Great Basin. They have a digestive system that allows them to really eat anything. They can get a little something out of any junk, and they just need water, and they can survive, and they are really they're very persistent. Also, so when we talk about the off-range horses, so these horses that are rounded up and they're put into a holding facility somewhere, or a pasture, or the government BLM contracts with private landowners to say, will you house horses on your land? We just need to inspect it, make sure you have the right facilities, and then we will put wild horses on your land and we'll pay you to feed them. So those costs today are $49 million every year. So every year, that's what we are paying for all the horses that have been removed from the range that don't have homes, and we just keep paying for them. So this is controversial. This is really controversial. And part of it has to do with just this conflicting societal views on horse management. For the most part, and I'm painting with a little bit of a broad brush, but ranchers will say horses are destroying rangelands and they're destroying livelihoods. And that is true, because I have been standing there when a trailer rolled up with all their cattle and said, there's nothing for my cattle to eat. I have a permit to graze my cattle here, but there's nothing for them to eat, and so I can't leave them here. And then they keep driving. And then the horse activists will say horses are cultural icons and have special legal protection. And they are correct. They do have special legal protection. Horses are protected by the law. They're protected by the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and they do have special status. However, they can't be managed at the expense of everything else on the land. The real issue, and what's very challenging, I think, for the agency that manages horses is the Bureau of Land Management, and they have a multiple use mandate from Congress. So Congress said to them, you have to manage the land for wildlife, human recreation, oil and gas, wild horses, and cattle grazing. That's a big handful to try to make all that balance. So it's very challenging. The wildlife conservationists will say, well, horses are ruining habitat for all the other wildlife species, and they're right, because I'm going to show you some evidence that horses are having some big impacts and they're really affecting other wildlife now. And Congress says horses cost too much money, and they're right, $49 million is too much. So let's kind of go through each of these controversial topics and look at some of these different viewpoints. If we look at the projected population growth nationally of horses, and we look through time, and let's just say, here's what the appropriate management level, this is what is deemed as, carrying capacity of horses, coupled with all those other things that have to happen on the land and everything they're trying to balance. So here we are, I can't point to it, I'll just point it out. So 2018, if you look at where it is, that purple line tells you what the carrying capacity is of that landscape if you remove all the cattle. So let's just say, okay, if you get rid of all the cattle on the land, it raises the carrying capacity of the landscape. So then you can have more horses on the landscape, but look where we are. Like, we're already over that. We're already higher than, even if you did get rid of all the cattle. We're already beyond that in terms of the horse populations. Some of the, there's a great synthesis paper that was written by Davies and Boyd in Bioscience about the ecological effects. It was a synthesis of all sorts of different studies. This is the best thing to read if you want to know about some of the ecological effects of horses on western rangelands. But essentially, they do a lot of damage. They increase cheatgrass cover. They increase bare ground. They lower perennial grass cover. They decrease species diversity. They spread cheatgrass. They reduce the seed bank in montane grasslands. They reduce the abundance of small reptiles and mammals. They increase soil erosion and compaction. And this list that I have here is not even remotely exhaustive. I mean, I haven't even covered half the studies that people have now done. This list is not updated. In terms of effects to other wildlife, feral horses employ interference competition with native ungulates by displacing bighorn sheep and pronghorn at watering sites. This is very challenging in arid ecosystems when everybody needs to get to the water. Wildlife also were found, even small animals are found to abandon water sites where horses are present. So if horses are just using them, they won't even come when the horses are standing there. But when the horses walk away, they don't even use those sites. They will use sites that were fenced from horses. So somebody did an experiment and they fenced the water sites, and the other wildlife used the fenced areas only. Sage grouse have reduced nest success in areas with horses versus areas without horses. This is probably because of the heavy grazing, and so when the grass gets so low from all the grazing, those chicks have nowhere to hide. So they need some kind of cover so the chicks don't get depredated. And horses also disrupt the lecking behavior of sage grouse. So there's a number of things, and also just to keep in mind, we live in the arid West. Horses inhabit the driest land in the most fragile ecosystems. They generally take a long time to recover from disturbance. So, and as we think toward the future, so this is the Great Basin in here, and that's really where the concentration of horses are. They're amazing. They can survive there. They do fine there, and except as long as there's water for them, they can survive in this habitat. But the thing to remember is that the future projections of any climate scientists are not for increasing rangeland productivity in the West. It's decreasing productivity with climate change. So these areas aren't going to get more productive for more ungulates or more grazers. They're going to get less productive as we go forward. There's also just controversy with, a lot of other groups are starting to weigh in. This is a letter from a hunting group to Sally Jewell when she was the Secretary of Interior, talking about these hunter groups were saying, you need to do something about too many wild horses. The Wildlife Society, which is the professional organization for wildlife biologists and wildlife professionals, they actually have a position statement on their position on feral horses and burros in North America. And then this was an article from The Economist back in, 2016, Dollars in the Wind, and they have a picture of a BLM truck, and the guys are shoveling out money and letting the horses just eat the money. Just go ahead and eat the money. So the bottom line really is that horses grow on average at about 20% across the West. And the horse population is running away from us. And they're beautiful, but it's getting away from us. And the longer we wait, the harder it will be to solve. So let's talk some about solutions. At USGS, we are the research arm of the Department of Interior. So all the federal scientists, our job really is to provide science support to our brothers and sisters in the DOI agencies. So when they have issues, we're very heavy on applied science. We're usually looking at tools and things to help them better manage wildlife or whatever the issue is. So at USGS, we started off back in 2003 or so. A guy named Francis Singer, who was my supervisor, he passed away in 2005, but we worked together from 1996 to 2005, and in 2003, he developed with BLM a strategic plan for managing wild horses, and they met with BLM multiple times and said, okay, what are your needs? What do you need from us, from the scientists, to better manage horses? And they came up with a good list, and the first thing on the list was, we just need to know how many we have. So can we, let's start figuring out how can we count horses. Some other work, so that's where we started. Some other work we've done is looking at non-invasive methods to gather horse data using fecal DNA. So we just got this, an army of volunteers, and just said, hey, do you want to just come and work on the horse range? We'll go out 3 times a year, 10 days, we'll camp, and you're all just going to go pick up dung, and it's going to be great. And then a lot of people signed up, and so we had lots of volunteers, and we collected a lot of dung, and then we analyzed it, got fecal DNA out of it so we could identify the individual horse from it, and we've been able to do quite a few things with that. We did studies, and we're doing studies on horse population demography and ecology. A lot of the information we have about horse ecology is 25, 30 years old. We know things have changed. What are their current growth rates? What are how is it different on the landscape and how are the horses different? So we've looked into some really just basic ecology of horses. We're developing a radio collar to track horses and burros with Oklahoma State University. Oklahoma State University is really developing an interuterine device, so IUD for horses. We're going to talk about a gelding study that we've done, and we'll talk a little bit about some population modeling and some economic projections talking about those really high costs of managing horses. If I have time, I'll talk about the new studies that we're doing. So I'm only going to focus on the things that I've circled because I don't have time to talk about everything. The aim of our research is to quantify the effects of management actions on horse behavior. So we're interested in their social behavior and what it does to their group structure. Spatial ecology, where do they move on the landscape, and their population growth rate, pre and post treatment. This is straight applied science. This is what DOI does. We're looking at how to support the management. So we also field test new tools for management, like the radio collars, and we're doing all this to provide data to support management. So I mentioned the aerial surveys. We developed these two methods with USGS Bruce LeBeau and Jason Ransom. Both of them were published, and since 2012, BLM has been using these methods widely all across the West. And so we feel very comfortable about the number of horses now that we have much more confidence in saying, okay, yeah, we've been using this method for a long time. That also enables us to calculate population growth rates, because if you have multiple reliable aerial surveys and you have multiple population counts that you think are good and they're, you trust them, you can put those together and start looking at population growth rates of your different herds over time. So we've started calculating, all of this is ongoing work still, but we've started calculating what are some of the herd growth rates across the West of these different populations, and they vary quite a bit. Some are very high and some are not so high. So eventually we'll start looking at what is driving that. Why are some herds growing faster and other herds are not? For radio collars, this was really very important. So the ability to radio collar ungulates has greatly advanced our understanding of their habitat use, ecology, and improved our capacity for conservation. We use radio collars on all ungulate species. I'm an ungulate ecologist. So the background is really telemetry collars have been used for over 40 years, but rarely on horses. The reason for this is because there was a study in the 1970s that went awry. It was written up in the National Research Council. They put out a report. And in that study, one horse died and other horses were injured by radio collars. So understandably, the Bureau of Land Management was very averse to using any kind of radio collar on horses. And so they didn't really want to do it. But there was a pilot study at the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge where they did radio collar some horses, and that was a start. And then one of my colleagues and I started a study with BLM horses. The need is that BLM managers need a way to individually mark and track and locate wild horses and burros, just like we do for all other ungulates. So what we did first is a pasture study. So we were just interested in, okay, how can we get these to fit? We want to make sure they fit right. So we tested them in a pasture, and it ended up, we tested these little mane transmitters. So we basically braided transmitters into their mane and their tail to see, can we just get a GPS something on them, and how long will it remain? How long will it last, so that we can track where the animal is going? And then we also tried the radio collars. In the end of that publication should be out sometime this year. The collars fit actually very well on mares and jennies, but not so well on stallions, so we just dropped that. So we started a field trial, and we only put them on mares and jennies, and we're still doing that right now, and we've been getting good results. And the tail tags, so the main tags didn't work very well in the captive study because their friends came over and chewed them all out. But the tail tags actually worked really well, and they worked even better on stallions. And so we're marking stallions now with these little GPS transmitters. We just braid them into their tails. And we put some out not too long ago with solar transmitters. They have solar panels, so the battery keeps getting recharged. It's this tiny little thing. And then it talks to the through cell service, and so it can send us the data. So it's just really cool, and if it works. The thing about the tail tags is they do the tail hair grows out. So eventually it'll be expelled. So they don't, it's a shorter acting solution, I suppose. So I just wanted to show you a picture of a mare wearing a radio collar. This is a little video. She's the Grullia, this gray mare there, this Grullia mare. She's wearing a radio collar, and you can see she's just walking around grazing with the rest of her group. But that's where it sits, right behind the ears. And we monitor them pretty closely to make sure everything's good with them and that they haven't had any wounding or anything like that. And it's really looks great. We're very excited about it. There's been a lot of improvement in the material, the flexibility of collars, and the communication systems. So next, let's talk about gelding. So gelding is something that's used within the BLM. When they bring stallions off the range, they usually castrate them because it's really hard to hold stallions. And so if they geld them right away, they can put all the males together, and then they keep the females in a separate area. So it's actually, it's quite common, and it's something that's been used for a long time on multiple species. So what we did is in Utah, this is in Conger and Frisco HMAs, which are in south central Utah. These are herd management areas that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. These two areas, we had one herd that was a treatment, which was Conger, and one was a control, which was Frisco. And basically we put, had 100 horses out there. We put radio collars on them and started tracking them. We started collecting demographic behavior on both populations and behavior data collection. Then we did a gather. We didn't, BLM did the gather for us. And they gathered them and kept all the social groups intact. So they basically had them brought in, each family group or social group at a time. And so we were able to not disrupt any of the social structure of the population. Then we went ahead and had, 50% of the males were gelded. Some of them were bachelor stallions and some of them were harem holders. And we wanted to know what happens to those harem holders. Are they going to lose all their mares? So anyway, they returned to the range, and we collected a lot of data over 2 years, 2017 and 2018. This study is still ongoing. It's not going to be finished until the end of this year. We still have a field crew out there this year. And they'll be studying until September, and then this whole study will wrap up after that. But basically our results were that at least in the first year after they were gelded, most of those gelded stallions kept their mares. We thought for sure they would, the females were going to say, he's not getting the job done. I'm going to have to go find somebody else. But they actually didn't leave. They didn't leave their stallions. And so there might be something else going on. We also are collecting genetic information on the horses, so we'll be able to look back at the foals and say, okay, who was your sire? If it wasn't your stallion because we know he was gelded, who was your sire? And so then we can start looking and piecing together, well, how is this working here? So it's actually really, really interesting and very cool stuff. Harem sizes didn't change. We were expecting maybe there'd be changes in how many mares each stallion was keeping if some of them were gelded. But you know what? A lot of them didn't lose their mares. And so it didn't make a difference. It didn't make any difference on the social behavior of the mares. Didn't make any difference on the stallion body condition. The one thing that we did notice is distance to water, but it was pretty much what you would have expected anyway. So the gelding, so any of the stallions that were gelded, they were identical in terms of their distance to water, the two groups, as the intact stallions. What really made a difference, though, is in the springtime, there was a big difference between the harem holders and the bachelors. And that's simply because the stallions who had mares have to be close to water because those mares are lactating and they're kind of tied to the water. So the stallions that, if you had a harem, whether you were gelded or not, it didn't make any difference. You had to stay close to the water because your mares needed to be there. The foaling rate went down slightly, and we won't really know until the end of this year whether it's effective in terms of bringing the herd growth rate down. But we did find that, that's about the same. So it did come down slightly in Conger. And then in Frisco, this was the control. They're roughly the same. So from year to year, it didn't change in Frisco. So our general conclusion so far, like I said, we still have more data to analyze for the gelding study, but We found very little to no effect of gelding on social structure, on time budget and social behavior of individuals, body condition, movement rates. But again, foaling rate will be a better determinant at the end of 2020. And social structure and behavior by the end of 2020 will let us know if there's any longer term gelding effect that we haven't captured yet. So more to come, I guess. The next thing I want to talk about is some modeling that we're doing. BLM has to use modeling to figure out how many horses do they have, what is the projected population growth rate, so that they can figure out, well, how many do we need to remove off the land to get back to like the appropriate carrying capacity. To do that, they are using something now called WHinny Quest. It's a solid population model, but it does have some weaknesses, and so we're trying to improve upon this. It's difficult to compare different management scenarios. It only saves outputs, not inputs, and there's no cost calculations. So you can't look at it and say, well, here's how much this management is going to cost. So we are developing PopEquus, which is a tool to evaluate management options, which includes outcomes and costs. What we want to do is encourage the BLM to do more tinkering with management and think about, okay, well, if we do some removals and some contraception and some gelding or whatever the tools are at their disposal, to tinker with them and see how they might reach their goals. So our goal with the model was to make it accessible but powerful and encourage tinkering. It's a web application and it runs on R. It's geared to the BLM, but it will be customizable, and we're expecting it to be released sometime in July of this year. That's our goal. The model structure of it is it's an age-structured population model, a matrix model. It tracks individuals that are on the range and off the range, and it calculates costs per head for animals that are on the range and animals that are off the range. So we're just going to do a quick example. If we have 130 animals in a population and the appropriate management level is somewhere between 90 and 150, helicopter gathers cost about $800 to $1,000 per horse. Whenever you round up horses, that's about what it costs per animal. And you can really never gather more than 80% of the population. It's very hard to do. It's hard to, getting 80% of the population is a lot because they're hard to catch. And the different management options are removals, contraception, or sterilization. So when we just run that scenario, here's what we see. So if you have no action, you do nothing to the horses, here's the AML, so that's where you want to be. Then the herd's going to grow up to here. Okay, so within 10 years, you're going to be up to 500. If you were to use removals, you do a removal here, the population drops down, and then it's going to continue to grow up, but it's still, at the end of 10 years, it's going to be higher than your appropriate management level. If you use contraception on the horses, it just increases slowly. But the contraception, you have to remember, you've got to handle those horses every year because it's only good for 1 year. If you were to sterilize or spay or something with whatever means, sterilizing is the only thing that keeps the population level, or at least incorporating it into the management. That's not a scenario of sterilizing every mare. It's only some of them. So if we look at the costs of this, basically what it costs for on range, if you're going to bring a mare in and give her contraception and turn her back out, or if you're going to remove her, but then you've got large off-range costs because now she's in a holding pen and you have to pay for her. If you were to spay her, it's about $250,000, or I'm sorry, $250. Not $250,000 for the actual surgery, and then she's turned back out. So in this particular scenario. So anyway, the take-home messages of the modeling. Anyway, this modeling shows that you can't decrease populations meaningfully with just fertility control. There has to be other things coupled with using contraception to bring the populations down. It's not enough. You need to treat with contraception 90% of the population every year in our modeling scenario. That's really tough. It's tough to handle horses year after year. They are not, they hide. The second year you come and try to fly over them and bring them in, they're not gonna come in because they know what it is, and they just avoid the helicopter. They're also most of the Western populations are unapproachable, so it's very hard to go out with a dart gun and get close enough to them to actually dart them and administer the contraception to them every year. However, I will say there are some small herds that are being managed with contraception, because in a smaller herd where the horses are approachable, you can get close enough to dart them, and that's how some small populations are being managed right now. Sterilization is highly cost effective. Basically, over that 10-year period to reach AML, you could save $1 billion. That's not small money. So I'm going to mention some of the other studies that we're working on right now. One of them is sage grouse, cattle, and horses in sagebrush ecosystems. We're doing this with our USGS partners in the West, in California. And that's really looking to tease apart the differing effects of cattle and horses on sagebrush ecosystems and how that might affect sage grouse. We're doing a study on mountain lion predation on horses in Nevada with the Nevada Department of Wildlife and Utah State University. One of the populations that we're looking at has a depredation on, basically the mountain lion diet is about 25% horses. So that's very interesting. We're working with the Navajo Nation to help them figure out what is their population growth rate of horses on the Navajo lands. So we're doing foal ratios. Go out and everybody goes out during the same week and counts all the foals and what the foal to adult ratio is, and then we use those data to calculate a growth rate. And we're also working on a donkey landscape ecology in Southern California with the Peaceful Valley Donkey Rescue and the University of California, Davis. The Donkey Rescue goes out and they collect, I guess they're contracted to capture donkeys across Southern California, like Death Valley and Mojave and NASA Goldstone and Fort Irwin. In some of those areas, they capture the donkeys and then they make them available for adoption. But what we're doing is putting radio collars on some of them and releasing them so we can find out more about their landscape ecology, and we're taking genetic samples too to see how are they all related to each other, and it's quite interesting. Okay, and that's all I have. So I'd be happy to entertain questions.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Why did the
She has to tuck into that, yeah.
Why did the radio collars not work on stallions? Because of their fighting?
No, we thought maybe that they were going to mess with them.
Yeah.
It's a great question. No, it had more to do with the stallions that we were working with had really big, thick necks in the holding facility where they were. They were all fed. And so these guys were really big.
It just didn't fit.
They didn't fit right.
Oh.
Yeah. And so they would flip forward over their face and like pinch their face a little. And it didn't look comfortable, but like one of them that happened, and then, we put it back on correctly. But another one, like you could see it kept going back and forth. The reason is that when the horses are grazing and their head is up and they're alert looking around, their neck is very tight. And as soon as they put their head down to graze, it elongates, and there's basically almost a 15 centimeter circumference difference between head up and head down.
It just starts.
That's hard. What's that?
But that just is
No, it was the same for the mares, but
Yeah.
they didn't have the problem, I think, because their necks weren't so fat. So we had some of the stallions that we worked with had more mare-sized necks. They weren't so fat. And those stallions did fine with the collars.
Can they just make the size of
We can no, because it's that issue that is when their head is up, you make it really tight, because you need it to be tight when it's up. As soon as their head goes down, you can't use stretchy material. The change in size made it so then the neck is all stretched out, and that collar flips over the ears. And then they stand back up, and it's really tight on their face. and it just looks uncomfortable, and it won't work anyway. I mean, so anyway, we sort of gave up quickly on stallions because we wanted to develop a collar, and we wanted to go with where we were having success. So we just said, you know, we're going to table that. We'll look at stallions another time, but right now we just want to find something that at least we can look at mares.
Have they tried to make contraceptives that last more than a year?
Yes, we've been trying for 20 years, and it
that
doesn't
hard,
work.
Really?
I mean, you know, remember Jurassic Park? I mean, life finds a way. It's just, they're just, you know what? It's really hard to find a contraception that works more than 1 or 2 years. Yeah, but people have been trying for a very long time. It's just really, really hard.
I'm going to presume that having a hunting season would be against the Wild Horses and Burros Act.
Excellent question.
So why not change the act and have a hunting season? Because that's a serious amount of meat for people to fill their fridge with. And I'm sure hunters would be enthusiastic.
They probably would. I don't know, but I know that that brings up a lot of the cultural and emotional stuff about horses, you know, and so that's, I don't know, somebody can pursue that. I know the Navajo Nation did try to do that. They actually were going to have a hunt because they have a huge problem on Navajo lands. They have so many horses on Navajo lands, and they don't have the means to go out and do these big, expensive helicopter gathers like we do in the rest of the West. They can't afford that. So they opened it up and we're going to have a hunt. And they shut it down because they had so much public pressure from activist groups.
So the politicians are not going to change. I presume it's against the act. So I presume the politicians are not going to do it because of the backlash.
I presume you're right. I don't know. I'm the scientist. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that's exactly probably right. Yeah.
Because that would seem to me to be the cheapest.
Yeah.
In fact, you can make money on it. I mean, you could make money off of getting rid of your horse problem by having a hunting season. Selling permits.
Yeah. No, great comments. Great comments. Thank you. I mean, that's how we manage all ungulates. We need hunters. We need hunting on all ungulates to manage the populations.
It's a little bit, it's going to be as popular as the South Korean dog food market. For those of us who have horses and live with horses, and which is still a good percentage of the American population, is not the kind of thing that's going to be easy to sell. Horses are very, very, you can form a very, very close bond with a horse, and you wouldn't feel so happy about them being shot and chased and all that kind of stuff. So it's tough. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it.
I mean, those are wild horses. Humans are not having a bond with that.
It doesn't. They're still.
Oh, they are.
They are,
Yeah,
and
they
they
are.
have families, and they
People
have
go out
lives,
and see them. There's
and
icons of the
there's
West.
there's a lot of human interaction with wild horses in terms of photography, in terms of visiting them and watching them run. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Be there, and they're living things.
You could say the same thing about a lot of wild animals, and people have sort of seen them.
Right.
Rocky Mountain.
It's different. I'm just telling you it's different. You can disagree with me as much as you want, but I'm a horse owner, and I have many horses, and I rescue a lot of horses. I have horses that have been rescued off the BLM. I have friends who have horses. I will tell you it won't go over well. It won't be an easy thing to do. My question, however, was do you have an idea of what you think would be the best solution? And I know you're a scientist, so you may not have gotten your conclusions yet, but do you have an instinct or an intuition about where this might go?
The modeling that we did suggests that the answer is for BLM to incorporate sterilizing mares into their management program somehow, whatever that looks like, whatever sterilization method that is. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds
But
about
the
right.
modeling shows very clearly that will lead them in the right direction quickly. Yeah.
Do you know,
Oops, I'm sorry. Taken over.
do you know what their bloodlines go back to, like in Europe or Asia? What is like the most common place?
I don't know a lot about the genetics of wild horses, but I do know that they are not. We thought for a while that there were a couple really unique herds, like that had really incredible Spanish markers, and we were all really excited and interested in those populations. But it ends up that they aren't really that unique, and that in fact most of the horses in the West are a mixture of a lot of different herds. Plus, management, so for genetic health reasons, you can't have populations that are too small, and so BLM moves horses around sometimes too. Also, I think some horses are more interesting to the public. Paints, some horses are prettier, and so in some areas, I think they have moved horses in from one area to another area to say, yeah, the public's going to be interested in these, they'll want to adopt these. So I think they're all mixed up. I think the genetics are very mixed. At least that's my understanding. I'm not a geneticist, but that's my understanding.
It struck me that your list of range problems, you had one slide there that was a fairly extensive list, but you said it wasn't fully inclusive, was the same list that I would use on almost all of the ranges, the BLM ranges that I've been on all across the West without horses on them, as well as with horses or burros. So, like, why, isn't our rangeland in trouble everywhere?
Is our rangeland in trouble everywhere? And that could you just repeat the question? So it sounds like what you're saying, if I understood you correctly, is all rangelands don't look good right now, and they're all stressed, and
Exactly.
it's not just areas where there are horses.
Right.
What most of these studies did, and what people are looking at right now, is specifically what is the additive of having an overpopulation of horses.
Right.
That's what it is. Yeah.
And then can you contrast that with your work in Mongolia with the wild horse populations there?
I only work with colleagues there. I'm not actually working with Przybylski's horses, and so I can't comment to that in particular. But yeah, so the only difference is that with horses, they're out there all the time, and they're really ubiquitous. They can go anywhere. I mean, they're incredible. They just go right up and over the mountains. You know, they go wherever. Cattle are only out there certain times of the year, and their numbers are very rigidly managed according to how much forage is there. So that's sort of the difference between cattle and horses. But yeah, I can't really speak to to your other question about all rangelands are stressed right now. But certainly there's enough drought that they all should be. But it's exacerbating. I would say it this way.
Yeah.
In Rocky Mountain National Park, we studied elk there for a long time. And the elk were overbrowsing on willows, and we said, we think you guys have too many elk. You might want to do something because they're eating all your willows. There's nowhere for songbirds. There's nowhere for porcupines. And they went ahead and said, okay, we have to do something to reduce the number of elk. Were there other causes to the decline? Sure, there were some other causes to the stress on that landscape. But the obvious thing was this is additive, and this is what we can manage for. This is what we can address. You can't really manage for drought, but you can manage for the number of grazers you have on the landscape.
So when I'm driving across Nevada or through the Navajo Indian Reservation and I see a horse on the side of the road or out in, how can I tell that it's not some rancher's horse, that this is actually a feral horse? Like in the Navajo, it's like, well, everybody has horses and you're going to turn your horse loose to graze. How can you tell the difference?
I can't tell the difference, but they can.
The owner.
No, they do. They have grazing specialists or grazing officials that are monitoring who's got horses, who's grazing, and which ones are feral. Yeah, they do know. They do know. And the ones that are in pens, sometimes they're in pens and sometimes they're not in pens. But, I sort of get what you're getting at, I think. But, no, they have a much better handle on which ones are feral.
One last question.
Okay.
And then I'll pass it on. Your slide that had the number of or on-range, off-range, and then you had an adoption number at the bottom, and it looked like the highest adoption number that you had was in the 6,000 or 8,000 range some 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It's down to 2,000.
Yeah.
So they're taking these horses off of the public range and they're putting them in feedlots or holding pens and feeding them, thus getting to that $49 million a year number. is there any way to increase the number that are adopted, or reduce the number that are in those feedlots? Because when you talk
Well-
about that iconic image of a wild horse running free on the range, you know, people aren't thinking of them standing around in feedlots.
Well, of course not. But are they thinking about the degradation to the landscape when you have too many grazers on the land?
Well,
Are you thinking about the horses that are starving? Because I've got pictures of horses that are starving.
Yeah, I mean, there's.
It's
which
really-
is
it's
a
horrible.
50-year-old law that's not working for the landscape, it's not necessarily working for the horses. Who does that 50-year-old law work for? I'm sorry,
I mean,
I'm sorry.
you got to talk to your
Okay,
congressman.
We got time for 2 more questions.
Yeah.
There's more questions.
So if they were kept to a manageable level, population,
Yeah.
is there evidence that these modern horses would be filling a niche that's left behind by the extinct Ice Age horses, or do they have too different of a ecology to do that?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
And the other thing too is that, I mean, that was 10,000 years ago.
Right.
How do you know? How would you be able to know that?
Okay.
I don't think it's knowable. You know what I mean? Like, are they filling a niche during the Pleistocene? I don't know.
Well, I mean, is there?
They went extinct.
You know, people talk
I don't
about
know.
rewilding things
Yeah.
and reintroducing species, and I wonder if they would be filling that kind of thing. It's okay. If you don't.
Except, well, the thing is, you have to think about what the land was like 10,000, 12,000 years ago. Was it identical to today? Probably not. So if you're thinking, okay, how did they fill that niche? Okay, great, they did. They went extinct. But then we've reintroduced them. And it's kind of a moot point because we brought them back. You know, they're back because of people. And we love them, which is why we're protecting them. And we love them, which is why we still want them out west. And they're a symbol of the West. We just need to manage them.
I was just wondering if there was any management for wild horses when it comes to endangered species, or if the 1971 Act addressed that at all. I know you mentioned greater sage grouse, and they barely missed the designation for endangered species. But I have to believe in all of that range there's a Preble's jumping mouse or something like that. So does that fall to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, to state managers? Do we ever pull state rights to manage horses on our own in against
Well, states have tried. There are several states that have said, why don't you just turn over horse management to the states? We manage all the wildlife. We're responsible for the wildlife in our state. Why don't you let us manage horses? Yeah. So far, that hasn't been gone over very well. But in terms of endangered species, I don't think it's really been tested yet. I don't think there's any horse range where, I mean, this is the first information that's coming out about sage grouse. And this is relatively recent. So there hasn't been a lot of study. I mean, I would even argue there's a lot we still don't know. And that, you know, when I give you that list of, well, look at all these studies, well, guess what? That's not really very many. And there's a lot that we still don't know that hasn't been studied in terms of interactions with other wildlife.
Yeah, because I'd have to imagine that dramatically impacts their sage grouse's wintering habitat because they don't move, and if their vegetation's disappearing. Cool. I'll be excited for that research.
Awesome.
I think
Thank
you should do
for
it.
coming tonight. Give Kate a round of applause.
Thank you.